Thank you everybody for coming. We're going to get started. I'm Cesar Garcia, I'm the director and chief curator here at the Mistake Room. And the show, Histories of a Vanishing Present, is something that I sort of conceived of and am organizing here. And this first lecture series, or this first lecture as part of the series, is really meant to sort of contextualize this particular project. It's a project that is composed of various exhibitions, but it's really research driven. And it's the idea that of how an institution can actually engage in a sort of multi-year research process, and how can it mediate to audiences and not just sort of present the shows, but also turn a process that's usually very insular, and that happens just, for us curators, that usually happens very quietly, and turn it into a sort of very public conversation. Like I said, I sort of want to forefront here, but in this sort of research process, this first show is really functioning like a prologue of a book, with a presentation of artworks by 10 artists who are all born after 1980 or after, and who are rooted or deeply rooted in the global South. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that. I'm really happy and grateful that my colleague and friend Naima agreed to this conversation with me. When I was thinking about how to do these lectures, I really wanted to have an opportunity to talk with someone who sort of knows my work, knows how I sort of put this project together. And it's really a very public process of working through ideas. We're not quite sure what this project is going to do yet, and that's sort of very much part of the process, to make something that would normally end with a show and a book and bring an audience along and to see how this is sort of put together over the next 2-3 years. So Naima Keith is back in LA. She's the Deputy Director of Exhibitions and Programs at the California African American Museum. And before that, she was at the Student Museum in Harlem, worked at the Hammer Museum on the seminal exhibition, Now Did This, and we're very glad to have her in LA, and I'm really grateful that this is your first speaking engagement since your appointment is here with us at the Mistake Room. I believe Naima is going to sort of guide just questions for me, and I think we're going to have a conversation and start that way, right?
Yes. Full disclaimer, Cesar and I have been good friends for at least 7 years. We probably text, email, chat with each other at least once a week. So we're going to try and keep this as open as possible, but it's a little bit more relaxed and casual. It's just because we've known each other for so long, and we really do enjoy kind of bouncing ideas off of each other and just talking about shows and artists and all that great stuff. So you actually jumped into my first question a little bit, and that was to give us a little bit of background on the exhibition. How did it come about? You mentioned, that the terminology used in terms of like prologue and that kind of thing are in reference to a book. So just kind of give us a little bit more background on how you came up with the exhibition, how many artists are involved, how you see kind of each, I don't say mini exhibition, but section of the larger exhibition functioning, and we'll go from there.
Okay. This has sort of been a project that I've been thinking about for a long time, ever since I was doing field work for a PhD and spending a lot of time in the Middle East and in Latin America, and sort of encountering a lot of young artists who were grappling. There were certain things they were dealing with, particularly in relationship to their own identities, their own relationship to nationalism or cultural heritage, or events that they didn't necessarily experience, but that had been so formative in the places in which they lived and worked, that somehow they had this commitment or relationship, and I couldn't quite define what that was, but it was always very interesting for me. It's also a very personal project because I have, it's something I've noticed, but I was born in Mexico, raised in the United States. I'm not a Latin Americanist by training. I've actually worked in Latin America very little. But regardless of that, there is a certain sort of commitment to that history that I've never been able to sort of grapple with and negotiate. And so that really prompted and made me interested in trying to figure out what this was. We are a small nonprofit space, and so I make lists like crazy every day, and it's pretty OCD. But I started sort of compiling names of these artists and beginning to assemble a pretty substantial sort of research archive of a lot of artists we were encountering. And when that happened, as we sort of went along, we're starting our 30-year programming, we really thought about how we could begin to make this, an exhibition program or a project. Normally, if there was like a bigger venue, I always sort of envisioned this as a biennial, as something that, I would be able to do a large-scale exhibition. But curatorially, the challenge for us was like, how does a project of this scale and scope and ambition happen within the institutional framework that we have? Mm-hmm. So we decided that instead of just having it, waiting for that opportunity, that we would try to organize an exhibition across time, meaning that we would set the next 3 years as an ongoing project. And it's not gonna happen every time, but the idea was, instead of sort of just arranging objects in space as we think about, when our work as curators, thinking about the possibility of extending a show over time and extending it over multi-years as a program within the institution, so that we could have the necessary time to do proper research, so that we could sort of look into different aspects of this project and do various focused exhibitions.
So they wouldn't happen at the same time every year?
They wouldn't happen at the same time every year.
And so how would audiences, viewers, know that it's happening? Just by the title of the exhibition, or how would people know?
That's something we're working through on now, and it was a question that somebody recently asked. I'm like, how do you identify it, or how do you, they use the word brand, which sort of made my skin cringe, but they said, how do you make it legible to audiences that this particular project is part of this larger initiative? So we're not calling it a show per se, but we are calling it a sort of, it is a research and curatorial sort of initiative for us that we're committed to for the next 3 years, and thinking about how this unfolds. I'm not sure in terms, right now it's the title.
Okay.
It's the Histories of Vanishing Present is the title of the broader project. This particular exhibition is called a prologue, and it's meant to be pretty straightforward, to function in that way, as a sort of introduction to sort of give the project a form in the context of the space.
And how involved were artists in the larger project?
For this particular show, it's artists that we have seen in all of our research, who know about the space. We had early conversations with them about being involved, but the idea for us was that we wanted to present some artists or positions that we're very interested in working with in a more sort of substantial context over the next couple of years, so that this really was an introduction. So they understood that. Okay. In terms of us sort of explaining the project to them, knowing that this really was sort of beginning to set up a series of geographies, a series of practices and questions, because we're probably going to be working with a lot of the people that are included in this rotation in other capacities.
So were they involved in terms of what works were chosen, and like how
knew
involved?
What works we wanted to show. This particular exhibition for me curatorially is structured in 2 ways. Okay. One of them is artists who are really grappling with this inherited history that doesn't belong to them, but that in some way has molded them. And there's
Can you give us an example?
Yeah, there's a term called like post-memory, and a lot of the show is looking at this idea of post-memory. It comes out of Jewish studies. A sociologist at NYU, Dr. Marion Hirsch, wrote about it to describe the generation or the relationship that second-generation Holocaust survivors have to that history. So people who didn't necessarily experience it firsthand, but their parents or their grandparents are so constantly involved with that history that she said that we actually inherit memories of events that we never experienced. And it is a way of speaking about trauma that in this particular case, we're looking at the mid-1940s, there's survivors, there's information that we can look at. I was interested in seeing if we can begin to talk about that term as it relates to other violent histories and other places that have been forged by these events of trauma, and if we can trace it across generations. And that really, for me, that really is the sort of backbone of this project, to look at how this younger generation of artists, and I picked 1980 for a few reasons. I picked 1980 because it was the sort of generation of artists to really be born and come of age in these particular parts of the world after these events happened. It's people who were born in Latin America after the military dictatorships. They didn't live through the military dictatorships. It's, it's people who, have a relationship to Palestine, still live in Palestine, still live in the Middle East, but they were born in 1980. So it's people who really, it's sort of the first generation to be born after these sort of key moments around the world, like after the liberation movements in Africa, after the military invasions in East Asia.
So you thought about the artist and the geography simultaneously?
Exactly.
Okay.
Because for me, it was sort of also a way to try to look at specificity, as opposed to just say it works for every artist under 1980. When we look at Latin America, we're going to look at it in relationship to sort of specific history, but through this lens. The reason that we didn't want to do one big show and say, oh, this is, we can speak about this, and the reason this project works in that way, I want to be able to look at regions in particular and focus as one exhibition project, and then look at another one through that lens in that way, as opposed to sort of generalizing it. But I am interested because I do think there is a generational relationship to it. I do think that for a lot of these artists, there's this constant struggle, and it's something I'm beginning to sort of realize and work through. A lot of museums in the United States and Europe are very interested right now in the Global South.
And I guess for audiences, let's define Global South.
The Global South is an economic term, and ever since it was Third World before, and those terms have usually been defined by financial institutions, by international financial institutions. The IMF uses or developing world, they've all sort of been used usually to define both geographies and economies. Part of that project is to look at what that means today too, because so many museums have been using that term to really explicitly talk about regions outside of the United States or Western Europe. But I actually am interested in also thinking about where the Global South is situated in the United States. And if we can talk about a Global South as a set of shared lived experiences amongst a group of people, as opposed to simply a geography. And that's something that, as we've been talking to some of these artists, is I think going to become a big part of this project, which is to figure out if we can come up with a working term on what that actually means today. And it's also really, for us, it's interesting that when you look at the Middle East or you look at Asia, you look at the sort of the way that those places are changing drastically, and we're still talking about them, we're using this umbrella term. So hopefully part of this project will be unpacking that. The artists that we are including are from these regions of the world, mostly for my own particular interests. They are places that have been forged, that have been colonized, occupied, intervened in, that have very violent histories that have that inform the conditions in which they exist today. And I think that is so much of what a lot of these artists are working through. So that's sort of what the term Global South is.
Okay, and then how are the artists grouped in terms of each? Go ahead.
For this particular show, we, like this sort of history as struggle, or I was talking about post-memory, and how these sort of artists deal with that. I believe I was mentioning that a lot of these sort of museums in the United States and in Europe have begun, they're very interested now in places like Africa, the Middle East. The Guggenheim just had like a whole international series of rotations. They had like a Latin America show, they had a Southeast Asia show. I believe they're getting ready to do the Africa,
yes.
Right? Yeah. And the new museum as well, like they did a big sort of Middle East show. Museums are starting to sort of try to fill in the holes, or fill in the gaps in their collections. And it's generated this really interesting relationship between these institutions and these regions. But for me, one of those problems is that, particularly with the Latin America show at the Guggenheim, that really did it for me. A lot of the framing mechanisms for that show, and when I say framing mechanism, just how the curators are writing about the work, felt very uncomfortable to me. Because it is artists and people that, aren't necessarily dealing with those histories in that way anymore. But yet somehow we're trying to position them based on the histories of Latin American conceptual art. And this is how, and these sort of traditions that for this generation, I don't think necessarily apply. A lot of the artists in that show were like trained in Europe. They got their MFAs in the US. They spent partially most of their time outside of those countries. But all of a sudden they're included in this big fiesta. And that was a big problem for me. And I think that is sort of how this project really began on, how do we sort of negotiate those histories? And I'm not saying that it's histories that they're refuting, because it's still sort of very important, but there's a tension there. And it's something I've been noticing as in our studio visits and as we travel. How do we sort of stop that practice, or how do we intervene critically into that practice of grouping people based sort of necessarily on geography? And and for me, the place to begin to look at that was looking at it generationally. What happens with the people who weren't born in the 60s and 70s, who don't have any relationship to Latin America?
But it feels like it feels like in a small way that you're doing something very similar, though.
Yeah.
Like that you're picking artists that are from, let's say, South Africa, and you're dealing with that history, apartheid, colonialism, whatever, and that you're looking, you're specifically choosing these artists because they're from these regions, they're 2 or 3 generations removed, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So how is what you're doing, how's your project any different than what that show tried to do in your mind?
The whole purpose of our project, I think, is to unpack that by doing that and show how it fails. Show how those particular histories don't hold anymore. And the reason we're doing it with a younger generation of art, with this particular generation of artists, for me, is that there's this weird tension that exists where they'll participate. I'm not saying they won't participate in those shows, but at the same time, their work is about much more than that. And for me, at the end of the day, and I've talked about this with Chris Kremlitz, who's our deputy director here, and as we've been talking about it curatorially, I think that what this project is starting to begin to shape up to be is a project about identity politics. About identity politics for a younger generation of artists that come after that big backlash in the 90s. How do people grapple with sort of identity at a time when everybody sort of pushed to the time of being post, as this moment of indeterminacy? And for me, I think institutionally, what I felt I hadn't seen before, and why I felt we had a responsibility to even begin a very small and sort of modest conversation about it, is that there are really pressing, real issues happening today everywhere, where the idea of difference is very present. And I think it is irresponsible not to talk about those issues. And I think a lot of people feel that not talking about identity or not talking about race within museums, or not doing that, is actually beneficial to the artists because we're looking at them in relationship to others and we're equal. But I actually think that removing that difference is also very harmful. I think it's important, particularly right now, for us to understand how these artists and how these histories affect them. And I think what this project for us is trying to do is figure out how we can even begin to talk about it. And it does come from a place of frustration, and it does come from a place of us. I mean, we've had these conversations behind closed doors. I have them with colleagues all the time. And for us, it was, can we start talking about it publicly?
And what were the artists' reactions to this? I mean, this kind of call to action, but
I think a lot of the artists we've sort of talked about this project with, and this has sort of been bubbling since 2014, really, since we opened. And the show that we opened with, I actually would say, was my first attempt at this project. We opened with an Oscar Murillo show. It was a very his own career, his own sort of position in the art world is very complicated. I think it's caused a lot of tension for a lot of people. And I think when we did that show, I sort of knew that something else, that conversation had to continue in a way. So we've had these conversations, and everybody says, yes, we should be doing them, And it came to a point where we said, we have a space, why aren't we doing this? Why are we just sort of talking about it and emailing and talking about it with colleagues, and how do we, as an institution, respond to some of these questions? And also doing it in a very public way. It's hard for me to talk about it because when I'm talking about a show, I already know how I want the artworks to behave. I already know what I need them to do in the space. You know what I mean? I already know to do that. So it's a really it's a different position to be in when I'm talking about a show that I'm still working on and that is sort of in progress at the same time. So
how has the show changed now, having opened and closed the first iteration of it?
I think that we're starting to get more specific questions that we like to explore. This show is organized as 4 rotations. So right now, the third sort of rotation is up. It'll go on through March 12th. But pretty much the way it works is every couple of weeks, we rotate work in and out. So the show opened with 2 particular pieces. Jumana Mana, who's a Palestinian artist, and Sila Storile, and Basel Abbas and Rane Abu Ramed, 2 artists based in Palestine. I think one of the things that it did, number one, on the response side, we've gotten a lot of great response from our colleagues, and now they're also getting a lot of other recommendations about artists that are engaging in this kind of work. So we already know that in the fall, there's going to be sort of the first iteration of it. I won't say too much on it yet, but I think it will relate really to Afro-Mexico, to a generation of artists living in Mexico who are from a region in the country that has African roots. And up until very recently, that population wasn't officially recognized by the government on the census, and it's just sort of happened. And so I think we're going to look at that in some capacity in the fall. So it's beginning to sort of give us certain research questions or certain prompts that we're going to start looking into specifically.
Can we talk about the title as well? I know we just kind of jumped in. Histories of a Vanishing Present is the name of the show, or research initiative. Can you tell us about what inspired the title?
There's a book by Gayatri Spivak, who is a sort of post-colonial thinker, and she writes this book called Histories of a Vanishing Present. It is a really difficult book to get through, but what was most interesting for me when I was in graduate school was a lot of long nights and painful moments with that book. What was interesting to me is that she was also, in the book, she wasn't only writing for herself, she was also trying to construct the reader. It was, it's a book where from the beginning she tells you that she's not only going to sort of write for herself and deconstruct sort of some of her own thinking, but that she's very much attempting to also construct the reader. The reader becomes very implicated in her process of writing. And there's
Which is also challenging.
Exactly.
Post-colonial studies. I mean, she's really kind of taking it on.
And that is really what inspired the show. That it was this very bold attempt to challenge her own ideas about post-colonial sort of studies and the discipline. She doesn't say she's a post-colonialist. She sort of does it, but she always says, I'm not trained in that capacity. And so that for me inspired it.
Are you taking on, I don't say the art world, because it just sounds so dramatic, but I mean, are you taking on, I guess, more traditional forms of how we construct exhibitions and to make them more, more research initiatives versus formal exhibitions that are curator driven, and then the artists are participating as well, but there's much more of a private process. How is this exhibition kind of challenging older models of exhibition practices?
When we opened the space, part of what we wanted to do was not just sort of bring international artists, but also begin for ourselves to rethink the way exhibitions could happen. Curatorial experimentation was very important for us. And for the first 2 years, I feel we've played it very safe. And I run a space called the Mistake Room. And there was something really strange there. And part of doing a show like this was sort of part of our commitment to that ethos and looking at our vision and our mission and really think about what exactly it is that we're supposed to be doing here. Most of our curators and interns who work here have backgrounds in academia. So research-driven exhibitions have always sort of been part of what we wanted to do. Part of the reason I have my own personal problem with the Academy is that it feels very insular. And it feels like there's 15 of us talking to each other via academic journals. And for me, curating was an opportunity to think spatially and to think publicly. So it is very much an attempt to see if a small institution like this could produce research that you would imagine would require a major museum infrastructure by sorting it out over time and see if we can construct a body of research over time that has that kind of impact.
I guess what was interesting though is that you're kind of hoping or expecting the audience to follow you through this journey, right? I think audiences are used to, they go to an exhibition, they pay their $12 at LACMA, whatever it is to park, and then they go through an exhibition, they walk out, and they feel like, okay, now I've experienced, I guess, whatever the show wants me to experience. Like I've done, I've learned it, okay, keep going. Obviously there are a few that come back, they see the show a couple times, or they'll be inspired to learn more about that artist. But by and large, it's like the idea that everything is that you need to know about that topic is now being included in that exhibition. So it's interesting that you're kind of hoping, expecting, hoping, wanting audiences to kind of follow you through this journey over a year's length of time.
We are. And I think we're also trying to figure out how to create connective tissue in between the more formal exhibitions, meaning like the shows that happen in the space. Like, how do you continue a conversation? So one of the things is like, we've been thinking about it like a music composition. We've been thinking about it like a score, right? Like if in November there is a sort of a show moment that crystallizes, and now like what happens in between to get people to that next conversation. And that's going to entail a series of different kinds of public programs, separate publications. But we really are thinking about it, not just within the realm of shows, but to create consistency and to continue this conversation for audiences, how do you maintain this research initiative present so that they know, well, oh, we may have a show here, we are going to have a show here that's not part of this sort of research initiative, and that's going to happen. Sometimes it's not going to, there's going to be other projects. So how do you maintain the sort of research that are going over time? So I think it's going to happen in these sort of in-between moments through other kinds of programs that aren't necessarily exhibitions.
I guess in that way it is very similar to a biennial because you are, in a biennial format, you're expecting people to go from location to location, that they have their map, that they're different sites, and you're hoping everyone sees everything, but you kind of have to assume they may only go to the more central hubs. But the idea that it's spread over a larger, geography is very similar to this format. Although you're doing it over time, in a biennial you do it over a space.
Yeah, and over a biennial is very compressed. So when you go to a biennial, what you end up seeing sometimes, you see the works, you go to different places, but not all of them, but some of them are really well researched, and there's like incredible sort of work that's happened even before the show's opened. Oqui's Documenta.
Okay.
Oqui's Documenta was so important, I think, for a lot of us, but it was because it took the idea of the discursive and made it very prominent into the show. There was 5 events that happened even before the exhibition had opened. There was substantial publications that I keep referring to that came out of those events and out of those conferences. But I think that if you're just a regular sort of museum goer and you went to see the show, you sort of see one dimension of it. And sometimes there's like programs, like most people go to the opening of the Venice Biennale and they're there for the opening or they're there to see the show. But there is a constant program of activities and performances that happens during those months. So for me, the idea is instead of compressing it to one big exhibition, could we do all of that like ongoing over the duration of a couple of years instead of compressing it? And then maybe what results at the end is a series of books. And, I don't think we're going to have one big show that's going to be the closing party. I actually,
I was going to ask you about a publication. Are you planning on producing a publication, and it'll be kind of like how the show is organized?
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
It's going to be right after the last show opens? Or are you thinking kind of giving yourself more time?
I think we're going to give ourselves more time, but also we just on our website recently, hasn't gone live. There's an editor's letter to an online publication where we're going to start posting things intermittently and sort of begin doing some, I think for me the publication that'll happen at the end will be a compilation of a lot of writings and a lot of things that will happen beforehand. It'll have an archival function.
So we were joking yesterday about whether or not we were going to go into the conversation about identity politics, and you brought it up a little bit earlier, because you were just saying that we've gotten to such a kind of a post moment, but now with Donald Trump and every hashtag known to man, blah blah blah, conversations around race are creeping up. Well, not that they ever go away, but I'm just saying like they're creeping up more and more. How do you see this exhibition, or this model? I'm actually more interested in the model. I was like challenging, but really kind of, my mom, that's my mom. Anyway, so how do you see this model kind of, challenge is not the right word, but
it really for me I have a lot of questions personally myself about what institutions' relationships are to these broader issues. And I think for me, what really did it recently, and we're being recorded, but ooh, it's one of those things, huh? I think we're very uncomfortable talking about race in our profession. Even those of us who are people of color have a very hard time talking about that. We don't want to be pigeonholed. Mm-hmm. We don't want to be the Latin American curator, the Black curator. We don't want to do that. But I think it's getting to a point where we need to have those conversations. The Big Mellon Foundation study really struck a nerve, I think, for a lot of us, on showing the percentages of sort of people of color in leadership roles in museums. So from the creative to the sort of administrative, and the numbers are terrifying. It's not surprising, right? But I think that we also have been approaching diversity in a really weird way, and in a way that I don't think is productive. I don't think you can just remedy a situation by giving shows to artists of color at major museums if you don't have a single voice or a single person of color on your curatorial staff. I think it matters. And I think there's people who think that doesn't matter. And that, and I do think that you can be allies, you can be supportive of artists of color, but I do think that having people at the table matters. And
so you're saying, for example, that this exhibition needed to be done by a curator of color?
Yeah, I do. I think it has to be, absolutely. And I think, and I struggle with that a lot. And we talk about it privately, and now this is going to be on the internet. But
I know,
which is fine. But I talk about it a lot because I think a lot of us, and maybe you can even talk about it as well, because you have experience working in a very particular kind of institution. I think we don't want to be pigeonholed, and we avoid it. I'm not going to say who, but a mentor of mine a long time ago, when I started doing this, their first piece of advice was don't do any shows with any Latin American artists for a few years. That was like their first piece of advice to me. They're like, don't do that to yourself. Like, expand your horizons. Develop a range, is what I was told. And I did do that. I worked in Mexico. I did exhibitions as an independent curator while keeping sort of other posts. I worked on Made in LA, and there was other shows, but it got to the point where I do think that I feel we need to have this conversation. We need to have this conversation now. Mm-hmm. And for me, part of this show is that, and it really starts with the artist. And I guess now since we opened this bag, one of the interesting things about a lot of these artists is that they're very conscious of their own identities and their own positions. They're conscious of this relationship that they have, but there's a certain kind of agency about their identity that I'm interested in. In Spivak's book, Spivak talks about the elite post-colonial, mm-hmm. which is a really sort of interesting concept for me to begin with. The idea of these sort of, she calls them the elite post-colonials, and there's a certain complicity where, like getting out of that victim mode, and like you aren't as complicit and you aren't as participating. And that for me was a really interesting idea because it expands the way we can talk about some of these questions. And I heard a comment at a dinner when somebody said to me, I know when I have to be Mexican and I know when I don't have to be. And it took me off guard. This was an artist who said that. But there was a certain agency of them determining that was very interesting to me. The idea that there's a certain agency by thinking about identity in this spatial way, in a contextual way. Mm-hmm. And part of the, some of the artists were looking in this show, for me, that's something I'm trying to figure out.
Again, we agree that a curator of color doing this show was important, doing this type of show was important. But just to play devil's advocate, why? I mean, if the artists are the one that are grappling with these issues, right? They're the ones saying, okay, I'm 2 generations removed from the Holocaust, for example, and I'm grappling with these memories or these issues that my family told me about, but I didn't personally experience, this trauma. Why is it important for a curator of color?
Because for me, it was dual. It was a 2-part project. Part of it is also institutional, and me doing this project here and making the institution complicit in that kind of work and in opening it up to do those questions, it was for both reasons. It was for, and I mean, it's a very particular case here and for this project. But for me, it felt like it had to be these voices speaking because it was too particular, there was 2 aims for it, right? Looking at the work in that capacity, but also really reflecting on this more institutional level, like what is our responsibility to these issues? And I felt like that had to come from a person of color.
I definitely don't want to end the conversation, but I feel like we've been just kind of keying back and forth, and I want to make sure that we open it up to our friends and our colleagues.
Well, I would love to actually get your personal experience on how to balance the, being pigeonholed versus really have your own kind of, your innate kind of identity that comes from your race. Because I used to have my own art gallery where I did specialize in, contemporary Asian art. And that kind of happened naturally, but at the same time, that was not the only art that I was specializing in. So I was in this weird place where I was being pigeonholed, and just because I'm Asian American. But at the same time, my programming ended up becoming more about Asian, art in a way because of also people and their, responsiveness. That they somehow, it makes sense for me to show Asian art just because I'm Asian American. So personally, Cesar, how did you deal with that in your previous experience?
I don't. I think some people still think I'm just a Mexican. I mean, it's.
And to piggyback off of it, how were you asking? I don't say forcing, but were you asking artists to also do that? Like because you're from South Africa, so you must have some relationship to apartheid. And not say it was that simple, is that simplified? But I'm wondering how the kind of conversations were structured.
I had seen the work before, and it was the work that did it for me. And it was because the work was looking at it was struggling with history in a really interesting way. South African artist Kamangwala Hulere, for example, his video piece was a reimagining of the island, which is a sort of a very important sort of South African play, but he did it with a choreographer. And so the video was sort of using dancers as they were moving these objects and these bones repeatedly on a stage. And there was this sort of endless sort of movement and repetition that was happening. And it was a difficult piece for me because there was never a sort of ending to it. And he was sort of grappling with this particular piece of text in this way. And we had a conversation about why that was. And it was, he was sort of reimagining that sort of history. Bazela Baz and Rana Burame's film Collapse, it does that exactly in a very formal way. They take footage from sort of sci-fi films like Battleship Potemkin and other films that show these moments of dislocation. And they've pulled them together with like home footage of Edward Said in pre-1948 Jerusalem. And just formally the work was doing that. That it was like this weird grappling with these histories in this way. Probably the most direct one is the one that just closed, an artist, Alexander Domanovich, who did a video called Turbo Sculpture about the history of and this is very recent, so I think it makes it more, I think it was more direct, but she looks at the history of Yugoslavia, Serbia now, or the former Yugoslavia. And after the very violent civil war, the country, instead of building monuments, every country memorializes in some capacity, right? Whether it's through monuments or buildings. They refused to put monuments up for anybody who was, sort of like their national leaders. So there's monuments to like Rocky Balboa and Johnny Depp and these weird Western cultural figures.
Wait, in Serbia?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, okay. I was like, okay, got it.
And as a way of like, And it was funny because people would come in and see the video and they're like, that's not really true, right? And it was like, yeah, it's true. And this happened, but this really public way of negating these histories.
Yeah.
And so it started with the work in that way, and the work sort of really did it for us because it started to point out that there was people doing that in the capacity. The video that's up now, and as soon as the conversation is over, I'm going to have it turned on so you can take a look. We showed 4 artists in the last rotation, and in this rotation, it was important for me that this work exists in the space on its own. It is by an artist from Cambodia who is speaking to the landscape, but is speaking to a sister he never met. And after the very sort of violent sort of period in Cambodia with lots of mass executions, there was almost an entire generation that was sort of disappeared and killed. And so for people who particularly of that age range, there's like, we were looking the other day at just statistics, they have a large elderly population, and there's young people, and there's an entire sort of group in the middle where those population numbers are sort of really low. And so generationally, when you're like, why aren't there any older brothers or sisters or older cousins or anything like that? And he's speaking to a sister he never met.
Wow.
Who is believed to be buried in one of the mass graves on the sides. And he's showing the sort of, it's a long video, it's about 20 minutes or so, but those are the kinds of works that were interesting to us. And so that's how that sort of conversation happened on pigeonholing it, was that we don't want to remove those narratives that are important, but we also don't necessarily want those narratives to replace our own. And that for me was really interesting when reading the literature on post-memory, is what happens when we don't want to deny these histories, but what is our responsibility in honoring them and remembering them, but also in ensuring that those narratives don't begin to completely remove ours. It's a fascinating book if you can read it, The Generation of Post-Memory, but the way that the book opens is that, she says that she has very few childhood memories of her own upbringing, but she can vividly remember scenes that she never experienced, like certain street corners where her parents told her where they hid and when they were fleeing. And she remembers those as if they were hers.
Wow.
But she doesn't have certain memories of her own. She said, but I can't remember the first apartment, we lived in or something. That's happened to me before. And in conversations we've had with artists, that idea of growing up in a household where you constantly talk about what, apartheid was like. And it's almost sort of like so ingrained and you don't have a direct relationship to it. For me, in Latin America in particular, is so many people who were disappeared. And the idea of disappearance has almost become this shared narrative, even though that necessarily wasn't experienced by everyone. But I almost feel like it's also part of a history that somehow belongs to me and I don't understand how or why. And it's that negotiation and the way that I think artists are grappling with that. That was sort of my point of entry. What it's starting to become, which the sort of question of identity keeps coming back. And it keeps coming back for those reasons. We went off away from your question, but I am going to get back to your question. But that's sort of how the artists were selected. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to not get pigeonholed. I don't. I think it happens. I think it is. It's a problem. But I don't know how to do that. I think personally, for me, I've shared this with a few people, but that was a piece of advice that was given to me. Don't work with Latin American artists for the first couple of shows you do when I was starting. Don't do that to yourself. They said, don't do that to yourself. And you know what? I hate to say it, but I feel like they were right. It's created a very particular circumstance, and it's allowed me to navigate in certain spaces that I don't think I would have been able to navigate through had I specialized. That's a term they like to use, right? So, yeah, I don't know how to do that. We're working on it. I think a lot of us are constantly working on it.
I want to talk to you about what you seem to be privileging one generation regarding its experience of another generation's memory, briefly. When I was a little kid, I remember my grandfather talking about colored people, okay? And calling people Negro and or colored. My father, this is in the same household, did the same. I remember when at some point that conversation stopped, and we started being called African Americans. And I remember at some point we also started being called black. But that other thing, it disappeared. That happened in a very short period of time, and it was shared by all three of those generations. Okay? So for me, the question I have is, why is the show why is now your interest not intergenerational? Because it is an intergenerational experience. It's not the memory. The memory is being generated from generation to generation, but it's being lived by all the generations who are alive simultaneously.
Absolutely. And I think that, for me, it was, when we started looking at this show, it was also very overwhelming. And I was trying to find parameters. The reason why I selected 1980 in particular is because at least in the regions that we're looking at, this really was the first generation, not to come up or be brought up to, but to be born after those things happen. And oftentimes they don't have any direct relationship to that history anymore. So for example, somebody born in 1980 in Latin America, or in Argentina or in certain places that they didn't live through the military dictatorships. Oftentimes their parents were very young when that happened themselves. So there isn't this constant presence in the household necessarily that is a direct relationship. And the reason that was sort of a framing mechanism for us was just because we are very interested in this sort of idea of post-memory, and it became a useful tool for us to set parameters, because I feel like I think we could look at this for many generations. That's part of it, but for me, it was very important to see if I could focus it so that we could have a very productive conversation around how this works. So that was the sort of privileging of this generation. Inevitably, we're going to have to talk about how this happens across generations. So we're not close to that relationship. We're not close to that possibility. But for us, it was important to have some manageable parameters. And in the regions in which we were working, that date in particular, I was interested in people who not just were little kids or were alive and existed in the world when these things were happening, but who were really born and came of age after. And sometimes, for the most part, don't have a direct relationship to this anymore. I think the post-memory term within Holocaust studies is interesting because it's looking at a generation that for the most part still has this. It still has a living connection to it. My goal in attempting to see if we can understand that across multiple generations of violent histories, for me, had to do with can we talk about how this has been transferred to someone who doesn't have those relationships? And if it does, then can we begin to look one more back? Or does it always have to just be with somebody who's actually experienced it? Does that make sense?
Listen, one more thing. I met Spivak many years ago, and I got to talk to her very briefly. And this is what she said to me about her getting her Oxbridge degree, to be a doctor. So you're invited to Cambridge, Oxford, and you delve into the history of colonialism by the British Empire in India. And you're livid when you all these things you find out, and you research your family's history, and you gather all of that, and then you publish. And she said, this is what the outcome was. Thank you very much for this PhD. We had no idea the exactitude, with precision, the harm we had caused you. You have now told us where our bombs hit and how much pain it caused. Thank you very much. Here's your PhD. That's what she told me.
She's a very complicated scholar, but one of the things that I appreciate so much, and for me has been the most productive, is that when she lectures or when she writes, she very much acknowledges her own position of privilege. And Gayatri Spivak, there's this acknowledgement of this particular privilege, and that for me was important, because when we talk about this younger generation, I also think that for me it's important to know that we're also sort of complicit, like getting out of that sort of victim mode in which a lot of the times, or the idea of reparations, oh, we're now filling the gaps of the collection, we're now including these artists, we're now doing sort of this, that kind of logic. I was trying to see if there was another way to do that. And where the title of the show comes from is because she introduces this term of a native informant. And she says that the native informant has replaced the sort of colonial subject as we understand it. And it's replaced this sort of person that has had these sort of acts and histories done up, to them. And she tries to sort of locate this native informant that he says, sometimes their position, I'm not going to quote her because, but I don't want to just say it, but something to the extent of sometimes sort of speaking from this sort of position of a victim or talking about this sort of position of being oppressed is just another strategy to talk about the other person who's sort of more oppressed than you are. And she tries to, during that whole book, to situate this entity. And for me, I'm trying to see if this entity exists in the world, and I'm looking at it through this generation. There was another question.
There was another question?
Oh, yes. How does the audience know when they walk into the mistake room that we're looking at the curator's process, that we're taking part in research or watching research or looking at the behind the scenes? That's my question. And my comment is, Transparent deals with this. The TV show, I think it's on Amazon Prime, but they talk about it as inherited trauma. Interesting.
I like inherited trauma, but I love the idea of an inherited memory. And I love the idea of inheritance. Because sometimes when you get an inheritance, it's good. And then other times, it's all these legal bills and all of these things you gotta grapple with. And sometimes not all inheritances
you prefer memory versus trauma.
Yeah, and I prefer memory because the idea, memory is active for me. It's not something that's biological that you have and that you remember it. It's not an object. Memory is something that consistently is memory happens, I think. It's both a process of remembering and forgetting. Right? For everything you remember, you forgot something else. But the idea that you can inherit, not a past, that you can inherit something you recall, something that's not even necessarily defined, and that you can inherit that for me, from this sort of ideas of the sort of work in post-memory is sort of interesting. To your question about research, I'm not sure. And part of these conversations and part of engaging in the exhibition process in this way, for me, which is a really sort of weird, exposed position to work from.
Because correct me if I'm wrong, I didn't see wall text.
Yeah.
I didn't see, more kind of traditional forms of, I didn't see wall text, I didn't see even the title of the show.
And I didn't want, that for me, I didn't want to do that. That was sort of where, there's a lot of printouts that you can take. There's a printout for each show. Instead of just, we asked the artists in particular to also speak about their work. So a lot of the writing that is sort of talking about the work usually is coming directly from how the artists sort of talk about their work. That was important for me. So there's a separate sheet that you enter into that sort of gives you the breakdown of what you're looking at, that explains the project in this particular show. And then with each rotation, there's the writings of the artist, because instead of us sort of creating a narrative around this is how all of the works relate, we wanted to sort of, to be able to have the artists sort of engage or speak about the work in the way they're positioned. Because for me, what this was really an introduction to this sort of constellation. That's a question we're looking at now. Mm-hmm. How do you do it long term, right? Yeah. Because right now it's okay, you come into the gallery space and you see the work, but maybe we'll do a series of events and maybe the show that happens in the fall, how do you relate it to this? How do you relate it to the sort of research thread? I don't know how we're going to do that.
And
yet.
how is it a conversation? In what ways is the viewer enticed or inspired to communicate with you? Go ahead.
Well, this is kind of one of our first attempts to do that. The reason that we wanted to have these conversations and with these respondents was for that reason, and doing them constantly. and sort of documenting and having them, because I think that for us is also sort of very important. But it is something we're working through, and we're very happy to accept suggestions. That was one of the that was actually part of what was interesting to us, for me curatorially and also institutionally, is like, could we have this conversation in this context? Could we talk about everything that you usually don't record and put up on a talk, but could we have these kinds of audience engagement conversations, say, is this working? Is this not? Does it work as a viewer? Does it not? Curatorially for me, that's also what part of this sort of project is.
Have any other exhibitions done what you're trying to do?
I don't know. I'm sure maybe somewhere. I don't
Okay,
know.
just curious.
How does the Guadalajara mistake room, what's the rotation there?
It doesn't relate to this project, but I'll tell you.
But
We have a space in Mexico. It's a collaboration with a residency there. It's a historical site. And part of the reason for us expanding is that our program here in Los Angeles is pretty strictly committed to bringing artists who don't live in the United States to show here, usually for the first time. But we really didn't have a way, we'll bring curators to do studio visits, but we really wanted to figure out a way to engage and be able to support artists who are living in Los Angeles. And this opportunity arose of having access to a space for a year in Mexico. So that is sort of how that functions. It is a space where we're doing exhibitions with artists who live here. So we have a Henry Taylor show up, his first sort of show in Latin America that just opened recently. And it's a historic sort of site. It's the former home and studio of one of the three great Mexican muralists, Jose Clemente Orozco. So there's like an unfinished mural on the wall. It's a really interesting site. So yeah, that's how that works.
And one last question, if anyone has anything. If not, I will.
No more questions?
I'm just wondering.
Can I ask Naima a question? No?
And I feel like I'm just like,
Can I ask Naima a question?
Oh, Lord. No, I'm kidding.
I'm wondering, I'd rather come back here for 6 months, and I see a Christian Grocer show in here, which that's what I'm thinking is going to happen. And there's a reason for that, because you're saying that there's two universes operating in this space simultaneously, which is this research pyramid, and then this, I want to put this work in this space at this time for whatever reason, because I want to. And so what the question here regarding how we following this narrative arc, and so I'm wondering, like, should I just like hold back and just wait for you to publish? He said, I'm serious. Just put like all your, if everything's good, if it's not going to be painting, or if it's work that can be represented on the internet successfully, then do I need to come here? We need to wait for your,
Well, but I'm not.
Yeah, but see, if you don't.
And I'm also not the only curator who works here, and this is a project that's relating to me. So, for example, when you say on the other work and how does it work, like there's Chris Kermitsu, there's Samara Kaplan, they're programming as well. This is this is my exhibition, so we have a program. So this is one, thread in that program.
Just the prologue portion alone is 4 parts. I've only seen one so far.
Uh-huh.
Okay? And I live in LA. I come here.
Of course.
etc. So if over the course of the 3 years, I only see, say, a quarter of the exhibition, which is very possible.
Mm-hmm.
How much of it do I get, or is it like me, like picking up a book and reading pages 1 to 10, pages 50 to 70, and like that? Is it like that?
I think, I would hope they would come and see all of them. And I would hope, right? And to experience the work. But that's also part of this project, is that it is a research initiative. Mm-hmm. And so it is not only made up of exhibitions. Like, for example, there are certain things that I'm already realizing this isn't going to be a show. This needs to be a small book that's maybe separate. But the idea for us is, like, normally if you work at a big museum or a big institution or you're doing a biennial, like, you can do these kinds of really scholarly shows all at once.
Yeah.
For us, the interest was like, how can a space of our scale and scope still produce that kind of research within the framework of what this space can do? And I don't have 150,000 square feet in which I can do this sort of survey show, do it at once, you can come see it, and then, you know, there's a book that you take home with you and you read more about it. The idea is that
But also you're giving the audience a benefit of time, right? You're
Yeah.
giving viewers a benefit of time. So like if you go to, let's say, Diana Theater exhibition, or you go to an exhibition, like you're expected to, you know, kind of go through the entire thing. You could maybe spend 1 or 2 minutes per, you know, video. But in this case, you can like really spend a little bit more time, then go home, think about the show, then you can maybe see the next, you know, there's opportunity to really kind of digest, I think, what you're seeing without necessarily the expectation of, I have to see everything, understand everything within the confines of when the exhibition is going to be open. So it's a kind of interesting model that you can kind of, that you become much more kind of active in the kind of exhibition intake process. Does that make sense? That you can kind of decide, okay, I want to see this show for an hour and then I can leave and I only want to see this section, versus you kind of having to see everything within a set amount of time.
Okay.
So in the research that you've done, have you come across variations between different cultures, artists from different cultures that fit this description of having been born after 1980 in the global south?
I think there's a lot of work we've looked at that were this is the first sort of show, part of the rotation. There's going to be more, clearly. I mean, there's going to be more exhibitions around this broader initiative. This particular one posed 2 questions that we're starting to sort of notice. One of them is this contentious relationship to history, in a way of like the bad inheritance that you get, like how do I deal with it, it's not mine. And then the second one is almost an approach to history as a ready-made, where like they understand that this is the place, these are the places in which they're from, but they're going to take that material to create something completely new. And those are sort of the 2 threads, initial threads, that we're starting to sort of see pretty constantly. These 2 very different approaches to dealing with history. Yes, I'm going to deal with it. It's cyclical. It's burdensome in a way. How do you work through it? And then there's been the approach of treating history as ready-made. There's a certain sort of, it almost feels like when you disrespect an elder in the household, but it feels like this approach where it's just a sort of material that I can use and repurpose for an entire sort of, you know, different meaning-making experience. Culturally, of course, there's a lot of cultural differences. I don't think that we're ever going to do a show where it says, like, you know, this is what's happening in Africa. I don't think that's productive.
Okay.
I don't think that's
Thank you.
productive. I don't think that's productive. I'm much more interested in the intersections. And for me, looking at it generationally was a way of trying to figure out how to create that kind of conversation.
Okay, last question, and then we're gonna, no pressure.
I think it's my what is more actually of a comment than a question. It's interesting that you actually, I haven't seen the show, so I would have loved to actually engage with that. It's interesting that you talk about post-memory and the new generation and what the new generation is creating. And I'm from South Africa, visiting Shoti. And I graduated last year, so now I come from a school where...
And you're Kamang's friend who just emailed me?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Hi.
And it's interesting how students of color in the art schools are actually much more forced to actually engage with their histories than the white students, for instance. And it's and then Naima, you keep on referring back to South Africa as dealing with this history all the time, and it's it's South African. Yeah. And I'm actually interested in actually engaging with the materials that you guys have been working with, and how to deal with like ways in which you can go about in terms of like how to work with history and how to not position yourself.
No,
It's interesting. It's interesting.
You know, it's interesting because I think people grapple with it too, but then there's also the other extreme. I can't give too much on it because then we're still. But there's an artist in Japan making really interesting work, where it's like about how you deal with the situation of not engaging with that history. So after World War II, as most of you know, like the war and the history of the war is not really taught publicly in Japan, at least for the most part. It's not a conversation you have. And very recently, and Japan didn't have an army until very recently where that sort of changed. And there's an artist who's making really interesting work around what sort of happens when now officially there's been this embrace of this history that for a long time was very publicly meant to not be spoken about. And he does these videos with kamikaze pilots who failed in their mission, so they're still alive. And he asks them to interview themselves. So they ask the questions, they respond to their questions, they ask the questions, they respond to the questions. And it's a whole different opposite side of that history where how do you deal with it when part of dealing with it means not positioning yourself at it completely. We're gonna look at that too. And that's really recent. That's sort of something that came out of this research. One of the things that the show has done really well, even if it's like our email blast or people, there's a lot of colleagues who have sort of reached out to us that these are lines of work that they themselves are doing. And it's sort of begun to build this sort of resource pool, which I'm trying to figure out now how we make it accessible.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I know it's really late. I just thought of Piotrowski. He, unfortunately, he died last year, but he wrote about history and memory, and he said that the history and the memory doesn't really have as much to do with the history, but a big part of history is what removed from the history. And so he's talking about the memory about the East Bloc, and also he's talking about what purposefully removed from the collective memory, like you just said, those statues of Johnny Depp in Serbia. That's part of that kind of a process. So I thought I saw the show, and I thought it would be really interesting to see what we purposefully forget.
I'm going to close here because we've been here for a while, but we'll be around for more questions and conversations. But I'll give, and also just a reading that it's been very important to me, but I just don't think it's for a lot of people. But my doctoral advisor, who's a professor at UCLA, Polly Roberts, she's also the consulting curator of African art at LACMA, is sort of one of the pioneering scholars of dealing with ideas of memory and secrecy in African art. And she spent a lot of time in Zaire, or the Democratic Republic of the Congo now, with a secret society, the Mbudie, a secret society that are memory readers. At the time of her research, if you were getting your PhD at Columbia or Harvard, you wanted to work in Zaire, in the Congo, because they were working with ivory and other things. And she encountered this little tablet that like scholars and historians weren't paying attention to. And it looked like the body of a woman. It had these scarifications on the back, and it had all of these beads. And she realized the Lukasa boards is a way of telling history. But the memory and the history depends on who's reading it. So there are these men of memory who read these Lukasa boards, but the memories of each particular village are different depending on who's reading it. And if you give that tablet to another person, so she says that memory, in fact, always happens in the now because it's situational. And so that depending on who's doing the recollecting is how you determine what's forget what you forget it. But for me, it's also becoming a really interesting point of reference to talk about identity. And can we talk about how we define ourselves in a way that's situational, depending on where we are in the spaces in which we're navigating. And I think that is becoming, the central question for this project. That hopefully, if you come back, or can entice you to come back, is what will unfold over the next 3 years. Thank you, everybody. I think we're out of time.
Yes.
Thank you, Naima.
No, thank you.